In 1879, there was a brewery in Newark, New Jersey, that was twice the size of Anheuser-Busch. Its three interlocking rings, stamped on every bottle, painted on every billboard, burned into the mind of every baseball fan in America, stood for three words: purity, body, flavor. By 1950, P. Ballantine and Sons was the third largest brewery in the United States. 4,500 workers, a 40-acre factory complex on the banks of the Passaic River. 4 million barrels a year. Ernest Hemingway wrote ads for their ale. Mel Allen called every Yankees home run a Ballantine blast. Their beer showed up in the hands of American pilots on Iwo Jima. Then it all disappeared. In 1972, after 132 years, the entire company sold for $4 million. Less than it cost to run the place for 4 months. 2,300 workers walked out the gates for the last time. The copper brewing vats, 2 stories tall, were ripped out and sold for scrap. How does a dynasty that once towered over Anheuser-Busch end up stripped for parts? This is the story of Ballantine. Peter Ballantine was born in 1791 in Mauchline, a small town in Ayrshire, Scotland, where the air smelled of damp wool and peat smoke, and where a working man's prospects ended at the same stone wall they began. He grew up poor. Not the kind of poor that makes for a charming origin story, the kind that pushes a man across an ocean. In 1820, at 29 years old, Peter Ballantine left Scotland for America. He carried no fortune, no family connections, no letters of introduction. His first job was working in a tavern in Black Rock, Connecticut, pouring drinks for other men, studying what they wanted, learning what sold. He didn't stay long. He moved to Albany, New York, and found work at an ale brewery in nearby Troy, owned by a man named Robert Dunlop. It was here in the cold Hudson Valley that Peter Ballantine learned the craft that would define his life. He learned malting. He learned fermentation. He learned that ale, dark, bitter, full-bodied English-style ale, was what the growing immigrant population craved. A taste of the old world in the new one. By 1833, he had saved enough to open his own small brewery on North Market Street in Albany. For 6 years, he ran it quietly, building a reputation barrel by barrel. But Albany was crowded with brewers, and Peter Ballantine was not a man who thought small. In 1840, he made his move. He packed up his family and relocated to Newark, New Jersey, a city just across the river from Manhattan, fed by clean water from the Pequannock Reservoir, connected to the biggest market in the Western Hemisphere. He partnered with a man named Erastus Patterson, and together they purchased an old brewing site on High Street that dated back to 1805. They incorporated as the Patterson and Ballantine Brewing Company. The partnership didn't last. By 1850, Peter bought out Patterson, took full control, and purchased land near the Passaic River to build something bigger. He wasn't interested in running a local brewery. He wanted to build an empire. His 3 sons, Peter Jr., John, and Robert, joined the business. In 1857, the company was renamed P. Ballantine and Sons. The name would survive for 115 years, and Peter Ballantine got to work. He expanded the ale brewery on Fulton Street until it became, according to newspaper accounts of the era, the most prominent structure visible when approaching Newark by rail or river from New York City. The smokestacks, the malt houses, the sprawling complex that announced itself before the city did. By the time the Civil War broke out, Peter Ballantine was the wealthiest man in Newark. In 1865, his brewery sold ale to the Soldiers' Reception Committee. A receipt from June 10th of that year still survives, one of the few paper records from a company that would eventually lose almost everything. After the war, Ballantine didn't slow down. By 1877, P. Ballantine and Sons produced over 107,000 barrels of ale, porter, and stout, making it the largest ale brewer in the entire country and the 4th largest brewery of any kind in America. Only 3 breweries produced more, and none of them made ale. Then Peter Ballantine, now in his 80s, did something his sons didn't expect. He told them it was time to get into the lager business. Ale was tradition. Lager was the future. In 1879, he bought the struggling Schalk Brothers Brewery on Freeman Street for $110,000, reportedly over the objections of his own sons, and launched Ballantine & Co. West, a separate lager beer operation. He lived to see that brewery completed in 1882. He lived to see his name on two breweries producing both ale and lager, dominating Newark's skyline and its economy. Peter Ballantine died on January 23, 1883 at 91 years old. He had arrived in America with nothing. He left behind the largest ale brewing operation in the United States and a family name that would echo through the next century. But here's what Peter Ballantine didn't live to see. What happens when the family name passes to men who aren't Peter Ballantine? Peter Ballantine left behind an empire. He did not leave behind another Peter Ballantine. His three sons, Peter Jr., John, and Robert, had grown up inside the brewery. They knew the business. They knew the product. But they were inheritors, not builders, and the difference would matter. Still, for a time, the momentum their father created carried everything forward. Through the 1880s, P. Ballantine and Sons continued to grow. By 1890, Newark had become the eighth largest brewing city in the country, and Ballantine was its undisputed king, accounting for nearly half of the city's total beer production. In the fiscal year ending May 1891, the company produced over 431,000 barrels of ale, porter, stout, and lager beer combined. The brewery complex along the Passaic River expanded year after year. New malt houses, new fermentation cellars, new bottling lines, the three interlocking rings, purity, body, flavor, were painted on every surface, stamped on every crate, visible from every approaching train. But something had shifted. Lager was overtaking ale in the American market. The same trend Peter had anticipated in his 80s was now accelerating beyond what even he had imagined. By 1891, Ballantine's own lager sales had surpassed its ale sales. The company was no longer the largest ale brewer in America. That title had passed to the Frank Jones Brewing Company of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Ballantine was still enormous, but it was chasing the market now, not leading it. Then came the next blow. In 1889, English syndicates, flush with cash and hungry for American brewing assets, reportedly offered to buy P. Ballantine and Sons for $6 million. The family refused. Rumors swirled that a deal at $5.1 million was imminent. It never materialized. Whether the Ballantines rejected the money out of pride or miscalculation, the result was the same. They kept the company and kept the pressure of running it. Robert Ballantine, the youngest son, died in 1905 after a fall from a horse. His death triggered a chain of events that revealed the cracks beneath the surface. Peter Ballantine's grandson, George A. Ballantine, sued over the family will. Another grandson, Robert D. Ballantine, was blackmailed and committed suicide, a story that landed on the front page of the New York Sun. The founding family was tearing itself apart. With no direct Ballantine heir capable of running the operation, control passed to George Griswold Frelinghuysen, the company's vice president, who had married Peter Ballantine's granddaughter, Sarah. Frelinghuysen was competent. He was connected. His father, Frederick Theodore Frelinghuysen, had served as United States Secretary of State, but he was not a Ballantine. He was a manager, not a visionary, and the company he inherited was about to face the greatest existential threat in the history of American brewing. On January 17, 1920, the 18th Amendment took effect. Prohibition. Overnight, every legal brewery in America faced the same impossible question. How do you survive when your product is a crime? Some breweries pivoted to ice cream. Some made near beer. Some simply locked their doors and waited. Ballantine chose to fight. The company began producing a cereal beverage called Clink, a non-alcoholic malt drink designed to keep the machinery running, the workers employed, and the brand alive. It wasn't beer, it wasn't profitable, but it kept the lights on at the Passaic River complex for 13 years, while other Newark breweries, dozens of them, went dark forever. Of the more than 50 breweries that had once operated in Newark, only a handful survived Prohibition. Ballantine was one of them. But survival had a cost. The company emerged in 1933, weakened, outdated, and in need of new blood. That blood came in the form of two brothers, Carl and Otto Bodenhausen. The Bodenhausens acquired P. Ballantine and Sons in 1933, immediately after Prohibition's repeal. They were not brewers by heritage. They were businessmen, sharp, ambitious, and utterly focused on one goal: making Ballantine the biggest beer brand in America. Carl Badenhausen, in particular, understood something that the Ballantine family never fully grasped. Beer wasn't just a product, it was a cultural experience. And if you could attach your brand to the things Americans loved most, baseball, television, the feeling of a cold bottle on a summer afternoon, you could sell more beer than any brewery in history. The Badenhausen era was about to begin, and it would take Ballantine higher than Peter Ballantine ever dreamed. But it would also set in motion every decision that would eventually destroy it. Carl Badenhausen didn't just want to sell beer, he wanted to own the American moment. When he and his brother Otto took control of P. Ballantine and Sons in 1933, the company was a survivor, bruised by 13 years of prohibition, running on fumes and reputation. The brewery on the Passaic River still stood, but it was aging. The equipment needed replacing. The workforce needed rebuilding. The brand needed reinvention. Carl Badenhausen gave it all three. He started with the product. Ballantine had always been an ale company. That was its identity, its heritage, the thing Peter Ballantine had carried across the Atlantic from Scotland a century before. Carl kept the ale, but he understood that the American palate was shifting. Lager was king now. Light, cold, easy to drink. So he invested heavily in Ballantine's lager line, modernizing the brewing process while keeping the ale as the company's prestige product. The thing that made Ballantine different from every other brewery in America. Then he went after the culture. In the 1940s, Carl Badenhausen struck a deal that would define Ballantine for a generation. He signed a sponsorship agreement with the New York Yankees, the most famous, most watched, most talked about sports franchise in the country. It wasn't just a logo on a billboard, it was total integration. Ballantine became the voice of Yankees baseball. Every game, every broadcast, every living room in the New York metropolitan area. The Yankees' legendary announcer, Mel Allen, the voice that millions of Americans associated with summer itself, became the voice of Ballantine. Allen called every home run a Ballantine blast. He referred to the company's three-ring logo as the three-ring sign. Between innings, during rain delays, before and after every game, Mel Allen told America to drink Ballantine. The jingle was inescapable. Baseball and Ballantine, baseball and Ballantine. What a combination. All across the nation. Ballantine, Ballantine beer. It worked. By the late 1940s, Ballantine wasn't just a beer. It was baseball. It was summer. It was the sound of Mel Allen's voice coming through the radio on a warm evening while the Yankees put another one over the fence. But Carl Badenhausen wasn't finished. He extended the sponsorship to the Philadelphia Phillies, plastering a 60-foot Ballantine beer sign on the scoreboard at Connie Mack Stadium. A sign that would stay there from 1956 to 1970, visible in every photograph, every television broadcast, every memory of Phillies baseball for an entire generation. He sponsored a drum and bugle corps in Newark called the Ballantine Brewers. He pushed the brand into every corner of American entertainment. Ballantine sponsored Milton Berle's comedy show, Three Ring Time, in the early 1940s. It sponsored the television Western Shotgun Slade. The three interlocking rings were everywhere. And then there was the masterstroke that no other brewery could match: the writers. Ballantine launched a print advertising campaign that asked some of the greatest authors in American literature a single question: how would you put a glass of Ballantine ale into words? Ernest Hemingway, the most famous living writer in the world, said yes. So did John Steinbeck. Their handwritten endorsements appeared in magazines and newspapers across the country, lending Ballantine a literary credibility that no amount of money could buy. This wasn't a working man's beer anymore. This was the beer that Hemingway drank, the beer that Steinbeck described, the beer of American greatness. By 1950, the numbers told the story. P. Ballantine and Sons had climbed to the third largest brewery in the United States, behind only Anheuser-Busch and Schlitz. The Newark complex employed 4,500 workers operating around the clock. The brewery sprawled across 40 acres along the Passaic River, a city within a city producing 4 million barrels every year. Ballantine had become one of the largest privately held corporations in America. And Carl Badenhausen had taken a wounded survivor of prohibition and turned it into a colossus. But the empire was built on a foundation that Carl himself may not have fully understood. Everything, the sponsorships, the celebrity endorsements, the massive single-plant operation, depended on one thing: that Americans would keep drinking the same beer, the same way forever. They wouldn't. The reach of Ballantine extended far beyond baseball stadiums and magazine ads. It followed Americans wherever they went, including into combat. During World War II, P. Ballantine and Sons was among the breweries that supplied beer to American military forces overseas. Photographs from the Pacific Theater show U.S. aviators on Iwo Jima, still in flight gear, faces lined with exhaustion, debriefing after bombing raids over Tokyo, with bottles of Ballantine ale in their hands. Not Budweiser, not Schlitz, Ballantine. For those men, 10,000 miles from home, cracking open that bottle wasn't just about the drink. It was about Newark. It was about the Yankees on the radio. It was about everything they were fighting to get back to. Back home, Karl Badenhausen used the war years to consolidate power. In 1943, he made a move that eliminated his biggest local rival in a single stroke. P. Ballantine and Sons acquired the Christian Feigenspan Brewery, also located in Newark, also historic, also respected. Feigenspan's brands, including the beloved Pioen, Pride of Newark, came under Ballantine's control. Carl ran Feigenspan as a second brewery until 1948, then shut it down and absorbed its capacity into the main Ballantine complex. One less competitor, more market share, more dominance. Ballantine was also ahead of its time in ways that didn't make headlines but changed the industry forever. The company was among the first American breweries to sell canned beer in six-packs designed for home consumption. Before Prohibition, virtually all beer was sold in kegs for bars or in individual bottles. The six-pack changed everything. It moved beer from the saloon to the living room, from the bartender's hand to the refrigerator shelf. It made beer a grocery item, a household staple, something a man picked up on the way home from work. Ballantine understood this shift before most of its competitors did, and it profited enormously. By the mid-1950s, the Ballantine empire had reached a scale that Peter Ballantine, the penniless Scotsman who had arrived in America with nothing, could never have imagined. The 40-acre complex on the Passaic River operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Trucks loaded with Ballantine ale and Ballantine beer rolled out of the Newark gates every morning, headed for every bar, every grocery store, every ballpark in the northeastern United States. The three interlocking rings were as recognizable as any corporate logo in America, and the brand had something no advertising budget could manufacture: literary immortality. In 1971, Hunter S. Thompson, the gonzo journalist, the wild man of American letters, sat in a bar somewhere between Newark and San Francisco and ordered a Ballantine ale. He wrote about it in Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, describing the moment he took that first sip as the instant when everything finally went right. Thompson called it a very mystic long shot. He was writing about a beer, but he was also writing about something deeper: the idea that certain American things carried a weight, a meaning, a mythology that transcended the product itself. Ballantine had become that kind of thing. Not just a beer, a symbol. The company even ventured beyond brewing. In the late 1960s, P. Ballantine and Sons briefly owned the Boston Celtics basketball team, one of the most storied franchises in professional sports. It was a strange acquisition, a sign of a company casting around for relevance in a world that was beginning to look past it. But for a moment, the three rings of Ballantine sat alongside the shamrock of the Celtics, two iconic American brands joined at the hip. At its zenith, Ballantine was everywhere: in the bars of Newark, on the televisions of New York, in the pages of Hemingway, in the foxholes of Iwo Jima, in the rafters of Boston Garden, on the scoreboards of Philadelphia. It was, by every measure, untouchable. But there's a rule in American industry that no one escapes. The moment you believe you cannot fall is the moment the ground begins to shift beneath you. And by the early 1960s, it was already shifting. The 1960s arrived in America like an earthquake that no one in the brewing industry saw coming. The country was changing. its politics, its music, its tastes, its habits. And nowhere was that change more devastating than inside the 40-acre fortress of P. Ballantine and Sons on the banks of the Passaic River. The problem was deceptively simple. Americans stopped wanting what Ballantine was selling. For a century, Ballantine had built its reputation on ale. Dark, full-bodied, heavy, flavorful. That was Peter Ballantine's legacy. That was the Scottish tradition carried across the Atlantic and planted in Newark soil. But by the early 1960s, the American palate had turned decisively toward something else. Light lager, pale, crisp, low in alcohol, easy to drink on a hot day, easy to drink 3 or 4 of without thinking about it. Anheuser-Busch understood this. Schlitz understood this. Miller understood this. They were producing beer that tasted like almost nothing, and America couldn't get enough of it. Ballantine tried to adapt. The company invested in its lager line, attempting to compete head-to-head with the national brands that were flooding the market with lighter and lighter products. But Ballantine's lager had never been its strength. The brand was built on ale. Asking Ballantine to win a lager war was like asking a heavyweight boxer to compete in a sprint. And there was a structural problem that made everything worse. P. Ballantine and Sons was a single-plant brewery. Every bottle, every can, every keg of Ballantine beer and ale came from the same 40-acre complex in Newark. In the 1950s, when Ballantine was the third largest brewery in America, that concentration was a source of pride. The biggest, most productive single brewery site in the country. But by the 1960s, it had become a fatal weakness. Anheuser-Busch was building regional breweries across America. One in St. Louis, one in Newark. More to come. Schlitz was doing the same. These companies could brew their beer closer to the customer, cut shipping costs, guarantee freshness, and respond to regional tastes. Ballantine was shipping everything from one location in northern New Jersey. The freight costs alone were crushing. Markets in the South, the Midwest, the West Coast. Ballantine couldn't reach them profitably. The company that had once been the most prominent object on the Newark skyline was now trapped inside it. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. In 1950, Ballantine was the third largest brewery in America. By the early 1960s, it had fallen to sixth. By the mid-1960s, it was the only single-plant brewery remaining in the top 10, and it was falling fast. Market share bled away quarter after quarter, year after year. The lighter the national brands became, the heavier Ballantine's losses grew. Carl Badenhausen, the man who had built the Golden Age, who had put Ballantine on Yankees radio and in Hemingway's hands, watched it all unravel. He tried to fight back. The company launched new advertising campaigns. It attempted to modernize the formula, tweaking the flavor profile of Ballantine Ale to make it lighter, more approachable, more competitive with the national lagers. The move alienated loyal ale drinkers without winning a single new lager customer. It was the worst possible outcome, a compromise that satisfied no one. In 1965, Carl Badenhausen made the decision that signaled the beginning of the end. He sold P. Ballantine and Sons. He didn't walk away entirely. He stayed on as head of the company until his retirement in 1969. But the sale itself was an admission that the Badenhausen era, the Golden Age, the years of baseball and Hemingway and 4 million barrels a year, was over. The question now was, who would buy a falling giant? The answer arrived from Wall Street, and it was the worst possible answer. In 1969, a group called Investors Funding Corporation of New York purchased P. Ballantine and Sons. They paid $16.3 million, a fraction of what the company had been worth a decade earlier. At the time of the sale, Ballantine still had annual sales of $70 million and employed 3,000 workers. It was wounded, but it was alive. A competent brewing company might have stabilized the decline, refocused the brand, found a way to compete. Investors Funding Corporation was not a brewing company. It was a group of investment bankers. They had no experience in the beer industry, no understanding of production, no feel for the brand, no relationship with the workforce. They were financial operators who saw a distressed asset and believed they could turn it around with cost-cutting and restructuring. They were wrong. The new owners arrived at the Newark complex and immediately began looking for ways to stop the bleeding. They cut costs. They reduced headcount. They tinkered with production schedules. But they couldn't solve the fundamental problem. Ballantine was a regional ale brand in a national lager market, operating from a single aging plant, competing against companies with 10 times its resources and a dozen brewing facilities across the country. The workforce felt the change immediately. On January 7th, 1969, 900 members of Local 843, the bottlers and drivers who had kept Ballantine moving for decades, went on strike. The issue was automation. The new owners were replacing workers with machines, cutting jobs to cut costs. The strike was a signal. The men who built their lives around the brewery could feel the ground giving way beneath them. New advertising campaigns were launched in desperation. The most memorable featured Mel Brooks, the comedian, not the baseball announcer, playing a character called the 2,500-year-old brewmaster. It was clever, it was funny, it changed nothing. You cannot advertise your way out of a structural collapse. By the early 1970s, the losses were catastrophic. P. Ballantine and Sons was hemorrhaging approximately $1 million every single month. The investment bankers who had paid $16 million for the company were now watching it burn through that entire purchase price in just over a year of operating losses. In 1972, Investors Funding Corporation surrendered. They sold the Ballantine brand name, the recipes, and the distribution network to the Falstaff Brewing Corporation for $4 million, plus a royalty of 50 cents per barrel sold. $4 million for a company that had once been the third largest brewery in America, for a brand that Hemingway had endorsed, for a name that Mel Allen had shouted into millions of living rooms for 2 decades. They did not sell the brewery itself. The 40-acre complex on the Passaic River, the physical empire that Peter Ballantine had begun building in 1850, was not part of the deal. Falstaff didn't want it. Nobody wanted it. The governor of New Jersey, William Cahill, was so alarmed by the sale that he called on the Federal Trade Commission to investigate. A judge refused to open a formal inquiry, but did prohibit the company from firing workers until union negotiations were complete. It was a small mercy, a legal technicality, a few extra weeks of paychecks before the lights went out forever. Because Falstaff had made one thing clear from the beginning. They were buying the name. They were not keeping the brewery. They would brew Ballantine somewhere else, in someone else's factory, with someone else's workers. The Newark complex, the 40 acres, the malt houses, the bottling lines, the smokestacks that had once been the most prominent object visible when approaching the city, was finished. And 2,300 workers were about to find out what that meant. March 31st, 1972, a Friday. The morning broke gray over Newark, New Jersey. The kind of late March morning where winter hasn't quite released its grip and spring hasn't yet made its case. The air was cold and damp, carrying the metallic smell of the Passaic River mixed with something else. Something faint, something that had hung over the ironbound neighborhood for as long as anyone could remember. The smell of malt, the smell of hops, the smell of brewing. By 6 o'clock, the first shift workers were already arriving at the P. Ballantine and Sons complex on the banks of the Passaic. They came the way they always came, on foot from the ironbound row houses, by car from the suburbs of Essex County, by bus from the neighborhoods of East Newark and Harrison. They carried lunch pails and thermoses. They wore steel-toed boots and heavy jackets. They punched the same time clock they had punched yesterday and the day before and the year before, and for some of them, the decade before. But today was not like yesterday. Everyone knew it. The announcement had already been made. Falstaff Brewing Corporation had purchased the Ballantine name, the recipes, and the distribution network. They had not purchased the brewery. Production was being moved out of Newark. The 40-acre complex, the malt houses, the fermentation cellars, the bottling lines, the cooperage, the loading docks, the offices where generations of brewmasters had refined their craft, would cease operations. Today was the last day. 2,300 people came to work that morning, knowing they would not come back on Monday. Inside the brewery, the machines were still running. The bottling lines still clanked and hissed, glass against metal. The rhythmic percussion that had been the heartbeat of this building since before most of these workers were born. The fermentation tank still hummed. The conveyor belt still carried cases of Ballantine ale and Ballantine beer toward the loading docks, where trucks idled in the pale morning light, waiting to carry the last shipments to bars and liquor stores across the Northeast. The brew house, the cathedral of the operation, where raw grain became wort and wort became beer, was running its final batch. The kettles, massive copper vessels that rose 2 stories from the floor, had been in continuous use for decades. The heat rising from them filled the upper floors with a warm, sweet fog that smelled of caramel and earth. The men who worked the kettles knew every sound they made. The low rumble of the boil, the whistle of steam through the vents, the deep gurgling of liquid moving through pipes that ran beneath the floor like the veins of a living thing. After today, those sounds would stop. The kettles would go cold, and they would never fire again. On the loading docks, truck drivers backed their rigs into bays they had used 1,000 times. Forklift operators stacked pallets with the mechanical efficiency of men who could do this work blindfolded. But the usual banter was gone. The radios were quiet. No one was talking about the Yankees. No one was making plans for the weekend. The conversations that did happen were short and practical. Where to pick up unemployment forms, which union hall to report to, whether the severance checks would come in one payment or two. Some of the older workers, men in their 50s and 60s who had started at Ballantine as teenagers, moved through the complex slowly, deliberately, as if memorizing it. They touched the walls. They looked up at ceilings they had never really noticed before. They stood in doorways and stared down corridors they had walked 10,000 times, seeing them for the first time because they were seeing them for the last. One floor above the bottling line, in the offices that overlooked the production floor, managers packed boxes. File cabinets were emptied. Framed photographs were taken down from walls. Photographs of Peter Ballantine, of Carl Badenhausen, of championship bowling teams, and company picnics and 25-year service awards. The photographs would go into boxes. The boxes would go into basements. The basements would flood. The photographs would be lost. That's how institutional memory dies. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in cardboard and water and forgetting. By midday, the reality had settled over the complex like a fog that wouldn't lift. The cafeteria served its last meals. The women behind the counter, some of whom had been feeding Ballantine workers for 20 years, ladled out soup and sliced bread and tried not to look anyone in the eye for too long. The men ate quickly or not at all. Some sat alone. Some sat in groups, saying nothing, just being in the room together one last time. In the iron-bound neighborhood surrounding the brewery, the impact was already being felt. Ballantine wasn't just an employer. It was the economic engine of the entire district. The bars that served Ballantine on tap, the diners that fed Ballantine workers at shift change, the hardware stores, the barber shops, the grocery markets that depended on the paychecks of 2,300 families. When Ballantine closed, it wasn't one business shutting down. It was an entire ecosystem collapsing. Newark in 1972 was already a city in crisis. The devastating riots of 1967 had accelerated white flight and corporate abandonment. Manufacturing jobs were disappearing across the industrial Northeast. The city that had once boasted more than 50 breweries was watching its last one die. Company after company was either going out of business or leaving town. The loss of Ballantine was not an isolated event. It was the final blow in a sequence of blows that would leave Newark reeling for decades. For the workers on the floor, the afternoon shift was the hardest. The machines were shutting down one by one. First, the brewhouse went quiet. The kettles cooling, the steam dissipating, the sweet malt smell fading from the upper floors for the first time in living memory. Then the fermentation room fell silent. The low hum of the tanks dropping to nothing, the temperature gauges settling to ambient. Then the bottling line, the clanking stopped. The conveyor belts halted. The last case of Ballantine beer brewed in Newark, New Jersey, rolled off the line and was loaded onto a truck that would carry it to a destination no one would remember. The silence was the worst part. These men had spent their working lives inside a building that never stopped making noise. The roar of the boilers, the crash of the bottling line, the rumble of trucks on the loading dock, the shouts across the production floor. Now there was nothing, just the sound of footsteps on concrete, the distant hiss of a steam pipe bleeding out its last pressure, the echo of 2,300 people standing in a building that no longer needed them. At the end of the day, they walked out. No ceremony, no speeches, no gold watches. They punched the clock one final time, turned in their badges, and passed through the gates of a complex that had been the center of their working lives. Some of them had fathers who had worked at Ballantine. A few had grandfathers. They were third-generation brewery men, and they were the last. Behind them, the 40-acre complex sat empty for the first time since the 1930s. The lights in the brewhouse went dark. The loading docks fell silent. The three interlocking rings, purity, body, flavor, still hung above the entrance. But they no longer meant anything. There was no purity inside those walls. No body, no flavor. Just empty rooms and cold copper, and the faint, fading smell of something that used to matter. Within months, the new owners, Investors Funding Corporation, who had kept the physical property when they sold the brand to Falstaff, began tearing it apart. The older brewery buildings came down first. Then the Feigenspan Brewery building, with its iconic clock tower that had marked time over the Ironbound for generations, demolished. The copper brewing vats, 2 stories tall, masterpieces of industrial craftsmanship that had produced some of the finest ale in American history, ripped out and sold for scrap metal. Anything that could be stripped was stripped. Anything that could be sold was sold. The bones of P. Ballantine and Sons were picked clean. The men who had built their lives around those buildings scattered. Some found work at Anheuser-Busch's Newark plant across town. Some left the city entirely. Some never worked in brewing again. The union halls that had once negotiated contracts for thousands of brewery workers grew quiet, then closed. The ironbound neighborhood, already struggling, sank deeper into economic hardship that would take a generation to overcome. 132 years. That's how long P. Ballantine and Sons had operated in Newark, New Jersey. From 1840, when a penniless Scottish immigrant rented an old brewery on High Street, to 1972, when the last worker walked out the gate and didn't look back. In the city that had once called itself the brewing capital of the East Coast had lost its last brewery. Falstaff Brewing Corporation kept its word. It kept the name. It did not keep the soul. When Falstaff acquired the Ballantine brand in 1972, the company promised continuity, the same recipes, the same flavor, the same 3 interlocking rings on every bottle. For a time they tried. Ballantine Ale and Ballantine Beer were brewed at Falstaff facilities outside of Newark, using formulas that had been handed over as part of the $4 million deal. The beer still carried the name. The labels still bore the Borromean rings. On the surface, Ballantine lived on. But beer is not a label. Beer is water and grain and hops and yeast and time, combined in a specific place by specific hands following a tradition refined over decades. Change the water and you change the beer. Change the equipment and you change the beer. Change the brewmaster and you change the beer. Falstaff changed everything. Within a few years, the differences were obvious to anyone who had ever tasted the original. The ale was thinner. The flavor was flatter. The body, the second ring in Peter Ballantine's Trinity, was gone. Loyal drinkers noticed. They complained. Then they stopped buying. The brand that had once commanded the 3rd largest market share in America became an afterthought, a name on a shelf that fewer and fewer people reached for. Falstaff itself was not long for this world. The company had overextended, acquiring too many dying brands and too few viable ones. By the mid-1970s, Falstaff was bleeding money. The company that had bought Ballantine for $4 million couldn't afford to keep its own lights on. In 1985, Pabst Brewing Company acquired Falstaff, and with it, the Ballantine name, the recipes, and whatever was left of the brand's reputation. Whatever was left wasn't much. Under Pabst's stewardship, Ballantine XXX Ale suffered the final indignity. The beer that Ernest Hemingway had endorsed, that Hunter S. Thompson had called a mystic long shot, that American aviators had drunk on Iwo Jima, was packaged in 40-ounce bottles and sold in convenience stores alongside Old English 800 and other cheap malt liquors. It became a bottom-shelf product, a gas station beer, a brand associated not with literary greatness and Yankees baseball, but with brown paper bags and parking lots. The original recipe, The formulas that Peter Ballantine had developed in the 1840s, that his sons had refined, that Carl Badenhausen had scaled to 4 million barrels a year, were lost. Not destroyed in a fire, not locked in a vault, simply lost. Passed from owner to owner, brewery to brewery, filing cabinet to filing cabinet, until no one could find them anymore. 130 years of brewing knowledge erased by corporate indifference. Back in Newark, the physical destruction was even more complete. Investors Funding Corporation, the Wall Street group that had kept the brewery property when they sold the brand to Falstaff, set about converting the 40-acre complex into an industrial park. The conversion began with demolition. The oldest brewery buildings came down first. The structures that dated back to Peter Ballantine's original expansion in the 1850s, the walls that had witnessed the Civil War and Prohibition and 2 world wars and the golden age of American brewing. Bricks and timber hauled away in trucks. Then came the Feigenspan Brewery building. Christian Feigenspan had been one of Newark's great brewers. A rival, then a subsidiary, then a ghost. His brewery, absorbed by Ballantine in 1943, had stood in the Ironbound for decades after it stopped producing beer, its iconic clock tower rising above the neighborhood like a lighthouse marking the shore of a vanished industry. The clock tower was demolished. The building was razed, another landmark erased. Inside the main Ballantine complex, the stripping continued. The copper brewing vats, 2 stories tall, engineering marvels that had produced millions of barrels of ale over their lifetime, were cut apart with torches and sold as scrap metal. The pipes were pulled from the walls. The gauges were ripped from the panels. The brass fittings, the iron grates, the steel catwalks, anything with resale value was removed and carted away. The skeleton of P. Ballantine and Sons was picked clean, joint by joint, bone by bone. By the early 1980s, the former Ballantine complex was unrecognizable. Some buildings had been repurposed for light industrial use, warehousing, small manufacturing, storage. Others stood empty, their windows broken, their walls tagged with graffiti, their loading docks crumbling into the Passaic River. The 3 interlocking rings could still be seen on the old bottling building, faded, weathered, barely visible. But you had to know where to look. You had to know what you were looking for. Most people didn't. Newark moved on, or tried to. The city had bigger problems than a dead brewery: crime, poverty, population loss. The slow-motion collapse of its industrial base that had begun with the 1967 riots and showed no sign of stopping. Popst's brewery across town closed in 1986. One by one, every remnant of the city's brewing heritage disappeared. Street names remained. Schalk Street, named after brewer John Schalk. The spectacular mausoleums of the brewing family still stood in Newark's cemeteries, marble monuments to men whose empires had turned to dust. But the breweries themselves were gone. All of them. Peter Ballantine's personal legacy survived in one place, the Ballantine House, built in 1885 for his son John Home Ballantine and his wife Jeanette. The brick and limestone mansion at 43 Washington Street had 27 rooms, 8 bedrooms, and 3 bathrooms, a monument to the wealth that ale had built. The house was donated to the Newark Museum in 1937 and designated a National Historic Landmark in 1985. Today, 2 floors are open to the public as period galleries called House and Home, displaying the domestic life of a Gilded Age brewing dynasty. The house survived, the brewery did not. And then, 42 years after the last barrel rolled off the Newark production line, something unexpected happened. In 2014, Pabst Brewing Company, the same corporation that had let Ballantine XXX Ale slide into malt liquor territory, decided to look backward. Eugene Kasper, Pabst's chairman, hired brewmaster Greg Dews to do something that should have been impossible: reverse engineer a beer from a lost recipe. Dews started with Ballantine India Pale Ale. He studied historical records, analyzed old bottles, consulted brewing historians, and pieced together what the original IPA might have tasted like before the recipes were lost. The result was a new Ballantine IPA, not a replica, but an interpretation, a ghost of a ghost. Pabst launched it as a craft beer, positioning the brand not as a bottom-shelf relic, but as a pioneer of American ale, a brewery that had been making IPA before IPA was cool. The following year, Pabst went further. In November 2015, they revived Ballantine Brewery Ale, a barley wine-style ale that the original brewery had aged for 10 to 20 years in oak barrels and given as gifts to dignitaries, including President Harry S. Truman. Dews reverse-engineered this one too, producing a version aged for several months in American oak barrels. It came in at 11.3% alcohol by volume and 75 IBUs, a serious beer for serious drinkers. A limited seasonal release, a tribute to a dead empire. Casper even hinted in a 2015 interview at the possibility of building a small brewery in Newark, bringing Ballantine back to the city where it was born. The idea was tantalizing, a resurrection story, the three rings relit in the Ironbound. It never happened. What did happen was the opposite of resurrection. In the Ironbound neighborhood, the remaining Ballantine factory buildings, the last physical structures connecting Newark to its brewing past, were demolished to make way for an apartment complex. The developers named it after Ballantine. Two modern residential buildings now stand where the 40-acre brewery once sprawled along the Passaic River. The name is there, the buildings are there, the brewery is gone. And in December 2025, the final chapter of Newark's brewing history closed for good. Anheuser-Busch, the company that Peter Ballantine had once dwarfed, the company that had built its own Newark brewery in 1951 with $64 million and 1,000 new jobs, announced the closure of its Newark plant. 475 workers were offered severance packages or relocation. The last big brewery in a city that had once been home to more than 50 was shutting down. Newark, the city that Peter Ballantine chose in 1840 because of its clean water and proximity to New York. The city where 50 breweries once competed for the American thirst. The city where Mel Allen called every home run a Ballantine blast, and 4,500 workers clocked in every day to fill 4 million barrels a year. No longer brews beer. The three rings are gone from the skyline, faded from the bottling building, absent from the scoreboards and the radio broadcasts and the magazine ads where Hemingway once described what it felt like to hold a glass of Ballantine ale. But if you walk through the Newark Museum and climb the stairs of the Ballantine House, you can still stand in the rooms where a brewing family lived at the height of its power. The chandeliers still hang, the woodwork still gleams, the windows still look out over a city that has moved on. And if you find a bottle of the new Ballantine IPA, the reverse-engineered revival, the ghost of the ghost, you can pour it into a glass and hold it up to the light and try to taste what Peter Ballantine tasted when he first brewed ale on the banks of the Passaic River 180 years ago. You won't quite get there, but you'll get close enough to understand what was lost.